Well, things got heated this week on the campaign trail as the economy took center stage. The three main parties ramped up the rhetoric around the D word, deficits. Take a look.
We are committed to balancing the budget in 2019. We have a plan for growth so that the economy can get beyond Mr. Harper's deficits.
He will run a deficit, a modest deficit. I guess it turns out the budget doesn't balance itself after all. But he'll run he says, a modest deficit, a tiny deficit, so small you can hardly see the deficit.
We've watched the Conservatives run up 8 deficits in a row. The Liberals are now telling us that they want to run several years of deficits. I'm tired of watching governments put that debt on the backs of future generations.
Well, you know who we want to hear from on all of this. Andrew is in Toronto, Chantal is in Montreal, and Bruce is in Ottawa. And Andrew, let's start with you. For a lot of our viewers, their entire adult life, they have learned deficits are a dirty word when it comes to campaigning. Is that still the case?
It depends which group of voters you're talking about. It depends what type of deficit you're talking about. To voters who are tried and true Tory voters, I think they still are a dirty word, if you want to use that phrase. To progressive voters, of course, it's never been particularly that much of a dirty word. And as the debt has come down over the last few years, or the debt to GDP ratio has become less of an issue. As the deficits we're talking about are very small, I don't think anybody's going to get too excited. If we were talking about $30 billion deficits, that'd be one thing. But the Liberals, I think, at the outside are talking about a $10 billion deficit. I think they've shown that they can get away with that.
Chantal?
I'm not so sure that most voters are into what number you put on the deficit, and I think most of them will tolerate deficits if it can be demonstrated that the reason for them is that the economy calls for stimulus. But to promise deficits, to say I'll be running deficits, is another proposition. And I think most voters are looking for some sign of budget rigor. Older voters, and there are many, remember the years when there was such a huge deficit that it was a major issue. And I think that many of them, and they're not all Conservatives, are wary of falling back into that trap.
So, Bruce, let's talk a little bit more about Justin Trudeau's strategy here. So we're not just talking about the word deficit, but a specific plan that he's committed to, embracing infrastructure growth through deficits. What did you make of that?
Well, I think the question was asked, does it make him a target? And I think it does make him a bit of a target, but that's probably what he was looking to accomplish today. For him to have a chance of winning in this election, he needed to find ways to claw himself back into the center of the debate, and I think today's initiative certainly has that merit. I generally agree with what Andrew and Chantal have said, which is that if deficits were such a dirty political word, it's pretty clear that Stephen Harper wouldn't have won such a large majority in the last election campaign, might not have won the election at all. In my experience, and I've been polling on this issue for the better part of 30 years, Canadians don't want to hear politicians who sound like they don't care about deficits, but they generally are comfortable if you keep the number in between the 40-yard lines. And I tend to agree that the size of the deficit that Mr. Trudeau's been talking about today falls broadly within that category, provided he continues to argue it well and gets the kind of third-party support that has showed up so far today.
Is there any cost? Go ahead, Andrew.
I was just going to say, it is remarkable, though, to see the Liberals popping up to the left of the NDP, or if you like, to see the NDP popping up to the right of the Liberals and maybe even the Tories on this issue. At the beginning of the campaign, I thought there'd be this big contest between the Liberals and the NDP to define what change meant. And I thought it was going to be that the NDP would be saying change meant a change of direction, of policy, and the Liberals would be saying, it means a change of governing style. And they seem to have switched places. It seems to be the NDP who are now going after those disaffected Conservative voters, basically Conservative voters, and the Liberals who've decided they're just going to go after the left of centre voter. And it may be that has something to do with the leaders. It may be that for those disaffected Conservatives, they're more comfortable with a Tom Mulcair-style leader than they are with a Justin Trudeau-style leader. That a lot of Conservative voters just can't take him seriously, who are prepared to look at Mulcair seriously.
Ian, I agree that parties have different needs. I think the NDP could not be saying today what Justin Trudeau was saying without playing to the caricature of the NDP. So Mr. Mulcair's position makes sense to me, but I also think there's a huge gamble in what Justin Trudeau has put forward as a position. in a way, he seems to be saying he's looking for votes that would otherwise go to the NDP. But the bigger pot of votes is those of the Conservatives, and swing voters in many areas, in particular in Ontario, tend to be blue Liberals who are more conservative on the deficit than they are prone to say it's great to run deficits if you're having growth. So I'm not so sure how that's going to play over the long term, and I'm not so sure how long Liberals themselves will be comfortable with that position.
Can I just add one more point, Ian, on that? I actually think that the play that Mr. Trudeau is making is based on an assessment that voters are growing more anxious about the economy. And if that isn't the case, or if it isn't sustained, then the appetite for this kind of initiative will dissipate and he will be left in a risky situation. What he's really doing is anticipating that as we get closer to Election Day, people will welcome the idea of government doing something more to create some momentum in the economy. And we'll see how that plays out.
When it comes to the deficit, using that word, there's a playbook that I've seen used certainly in provincial elections where you can say absolutely no deficit during the campaign, and then things change. You know, once whether you're the government that gets back in, or especially if you get into government, you can say, hey, look, I didn't realize the books look as bad as they do. And I wonder, Andrew, is there any cost to that if Tom Mulcair were to discover 6 months later things have changed?
As you say, we've certainly seen the cupboard is bare routine played out. There is a cost, but it's a cost after you've already won the election. I think it'll behoove all of us in the press and others to ask him pretty close questions. He's made a pretty firm commitment. He could have just said, you know, I'll balance the budget over the course of our first government. But he said later on the line, I'll balance it in year one. So he's gone out of his way to make that an issue. There's a lot of questions about whether he's, you know, where he's going to find the money to cut spending or to raise taxes to make those books balance. So a lot of close questions should be asked of him from here on in.
Yeah, but two things. I think both parties are playing with ghosts here, the NDP and the Liberals. I think Tom Mulcair is fighting the ghost of Bob Rae in Ontario by saying, I'm not going to be Bob Rae. There was a recession and he tried to spend his way out of it, and the perception is that that was bad. But I also think Justin Trudeau, up to a point, raised his father's ghost by saying we're going to grow the economy through deficits. I'm not so sure that that's a great ghost to raise.
Let's talk about the campaign, week 4, and is there anything that jumps out at you as being particularly significant as we near the end of the week?
Well, the thing that occurs to me is I'm watching the Conservative campaign. It's a very well organized, very well funded campaign. And I'm struck by the fact that I think the Conservatives have a pretty good economic case to make. It's certainly not the kind of thing that pleases everybody. But I feel as though they're getting in their way more often than not. On too many days, the story that's emerging is, set aside the Duffy issue, which is obviously a very significant distraction for them, but their management of crowds, their management of the media, their relationship to the idea of kind of open and active participation in our democracy has become a distraction, I think, that's taken away from their message. And as a result, if they have something to say about how the economy will get better if they get elected again, that's being a little bit lost right now. So if I were the Conservatives, I would say, are there things that we can do to be less in our way with the message that we're trying to get out?
I think you've seen a Conservative campaign that is, the air is going out of it. This is not a campaign that is going well for them. I think the Duffy trial, and I'll freely admit I was wrong about this, I think has done them a lot more damage certainly than I anticipated, partly because we got some new information about who knew what in the Prime Minister's office, Ray Novak in particular, but also because of the way they've responded to it. They've just looked really bad. And I think the cue to how badly they're doing is that if you look at the Liberals and the NDP, they're spending more time attacking each other than they are the governing Conservatives.
Yeah, well, two things. Sometimes small things tell you a lot about a campaign, and I was amazed, for instance, this week that on the week when the economy becomes a topic on which Stephen Harper would have some kind of an edge, the finance minister is booked to speak in a private club, to a men's-only club, and that's a side issue. And you think, is there someone in central casting that's figured this out? And there have been all kinds of little errors. They're not big. I mean, to use the wrong salmon is not the biggest mistake you'll ever make. But this accumulation to have Boy Scouts when you shouldn't, it says something about some kind of sloppiness about the campaign. I also noticed today that Justin Trudeau's position on having deficits seems to have breathed some life in Stephen Harper after almost a month on the trail.
We started asking about the conventional wisdom when it came to deficits. Let me ask you about another piece of conventional wisdom that's only a few weeks old, and that is the summer portion of this campaign wouldn't matter, that it happens for real after Labor Day. Chantal, I'll start with you, but I'd like to hear from all of you on this. Does what's been unfolding over the last few days matter much come Election Day?
I believe that everything matters in the same way that I believe that the Duffy trial would make a difference. And the reason why it's made a difference is actually because people in the summer have been paying attention.
Bruce?
Well, I think I agree. Everything does matter. I think the tendency on the part of commentators sometimes is to say, if an issue happens and it doesn't matter to every voter, then it doesn't matter at all. But we've got a three-party race right now, and the movement of 5 to 10 percentage points is massive in terms of outcomes. I do think that the Duffy trial has had an impact on how people are looking at the Prime Minister and the Conservative Party. That may be shrugged off over time. We'll see. And I also think that the parties are getting tested, getting better at delivering their messages in many cases, and so it'll make for a more interesting campaign in some respects for the last month.
And Andrew, last word to you.
The first period of a hockey game matters. If you fall too many goals behind, that's going to matter. If you get winded and you can't perform later in the game, that's going to matter. But ultimately, it's the third period where the action really counts. So yeah, they're laying down some markers here. They're trying out campaign themes. They're trying to do some damage to each other. But I do think come Labor Day, you're going to see that taken to another level.
You have to respect, in the end of August, a hockey metaphor already being dusted off. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you.
And for those of you who can't get enough of the campaign, now you can get a weekend fix of CBC's Power in Politics with Rosemary Barton every Sunday for the rest of the election. That's at 10 a.m. and again at 8 p.m. Eastern Time on CBC News Network and on CBC Television at 11 a.m. across the country, 11:30 in Newfoundland.